Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the final episode of the Tap Shift series. I'd like to invite you to check out the description of the video to learn how you can become an early access tester. Our testers receive occasional in-game rewards such as free currency to purchase items and extra replays. This is a simple game, but we are interested in testing our more complicated connected systems such as cross-platform accounts, cross-game currency, achievements, and leaderboards. If you are interested in participating, just check the description. Now let's go ahead and get into the video. In this episode, we're going to close out the series by creating a simple splash screen with a smooth transition to a main menu. We're also going to talk about where you can find unique music and sound effects, and how to play custom audio types throughout your game. As usual, let's go ahead and recap what we have so far. I'll play the game, and we can just tap through. Whenever we get hit, you can see that a little animation plays with the particle effect. We get a game over screen that tells us what our player score was, and then we have a button that lets us try again, and that simply resets the game. In the top left corner, we have a counter that's telling us what our score is, and we have a couple of pickups that are functional. We have one pickup that's an invincibility pickup, and one pickup that gives us an additional point every time we pass through an obstacle. So that's about what we have right now. And again, we're going to start off this tutorial by creating a splash scene that's going to have a splash screen, which may have the company logo or whatever you want. Perhaps it'll just be the name of the game. And then you may even want to play a sound effect. At this point, I would want to remind you that we are using a package called Unity Core, and you can go on to the GitHub link that's in the description to download those Unity Core scripts. Unity Core is going to have a class called Scene Controller. Let's go ahead and open that up and see what's in there. So just to recap, in our Scene Controller, we do have some constant definitions for the types of scenes that we plan on using. This is using the scene type enumeration. If we open up the scene type script, you can see that we have none, menu, and game. Now these are just some default scene types that we added. You can go ahead and modify these to whatever you're going to need for your game. For us, we're going to want a splash scene and a game scene. That means back in the scene controller, we're going to want to make sure that we are reflecting those new scene types. So instead of menu, we're going to want this to be splash. And all of these string constants that we're using will change accordingly. So we're specifically modifying the scene type to string function and the string to scene type function. So in our string to scene type function, instead of menu, we'll want to use splash. And for the scene type, we'll return splash. I'm just going to do a quick search throughout the script to make sure that I didn't miss anything. I'm going to do a search on the menu. And it looks like we have cleaned up everything that we needed to in the scene controller. When you come back to Unity, you'll see that you have a new error in our test scene script, which is expected. So to clear that error, we can just double click on that. And you'll see that that's because we're testing the load on scenetype.menu. Well, menu doesn't exist anymore, so we can change that to splash. Now that we have successfully integrated our changes with the Unity Core script for the scene controller, we can talk about what we want to do in the actual Unity editor. So we know that we're going to be working with two scenes. One is the splash scene and the other is the game scene. Well, we currently already have the game scene. That's the scene that we've been working in. We also want to add a new scene called splash. So we'll go to our scenes folder and create a new scene, and we're going to name that splash. Before we forget, we want to make sure that we go up to our build settings, we open up the splash screen, and then we add the open scene. So now we have the splash scene and the game scene in our build settings. Because the splash scene is presumably where the game is going to start, this is where we're going to want to initialize all of our persistent objects. That will include our persistent UI and our persistent systems. So I'm going to create an empty object called core systems. This will have any of our persistent systems that could be including the data controller, the scene controller, the session controller, and other core systems that would be persistent. We're also going to have a persistent UI object. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new canvas and name this persistent UI. Persistent UI is going to have our loading screen on it because we want the loading screen to fade in the splash scene and fade out when we're in the game scene. So that UI is going to be persisting throughout multiple scenes. That means that we're going to want the page controller on our persistent UI, and we want that page controller to hold a reference to our loading screen. As with all of our new systems, we want to make sure that we are enabling the debug parameter. That's going to make sure that if any issues arise, we'll be getting the notifications in our console. So in working with this menu system, we do want to remember that this is also coming from our Unity core scripts. We want to make sure that we actually do have a loading page, and you can check the page type script from the Unity core scripts. We do actually have the loading enumeration, so we are good to go there. Back in Unity, we can go ahead and safely create this new loading page. Our loading page is simply going to be an image that takes up the full width and height of the screen. So this is actually going to just be a black page that takes up the entire screen. And then we can even put some text on this to signify that we are loading. So I'll also add some text to the middle of the screen. And this is just going to say loading. And I'll make sure that I change the color of that to white so that it's easy to see. I'll also go ahead and increase the size of the text so that it's a little bit easier to see. And that's all we need to do for our loading page. Let's change the name of our loading page from image to loading page. And then make sure that we add the page component and change the type to loading. With the loading page created, we want to make sure that our page controller has a reference to that page. So we'll go to our page controller and drag the loading page into the first reference of our page's variable. After we're done creating our loading page, we can go ahead and deactivate the page because the menu controller is responsible for actually activating that page when it's needed. Now we can go ahead and start designing our splash scene. Our splash scene is simply going to show some sort of logo or text or title. Whatever you want is up to you. And that's going to be held in a scene UI object. So I'm going to create a new canvas, and this is going to be our scene UI. Now our scene UI is not going to have a page controller on it because it's only going to live in the context of this scene. So I'm just going to design this however I want. I'll go ahead and maybe just add the title of the game here. You can also add a company logo. So this might be your logo. And then you can also add the game title. I recommend coming up with a new name for your specific game, just so it's easier for people to find your specific game on the Play Store. To keep things simple, we're going to leave the splash screen how it is. It's simple enough and it gets the point across. And then we're going to go to our core systems object. We're going to add the scene controller and the session controller. I'm going to remember to debug the scene controller just in case any issues come up. I'll get the appropriate logging message in the console. Our session controller is now going to have to be modified to move us from our splash screen to our game scene. Start off by adding the using statement using unitycore.scene. This will allow us to have a reference to our scene controller. Then you can add a private reference to the scene controller, private scene controller, and then we can call this scene. We'll want to make sure that we're actually getting the scene controller with some amount of integrity. To do that, we can add this private property for the scene controller. What we do here is we try to get the scene controller. If we don't actually get a reference to the scene controller after this point, then we go ahead and log a warning that tells the developer that the scene controller could not be found. We finish by returning the scene controller. Now that we know we have a reference to our scene, we can continue with actually calling the load scene function. We do that in the start session function that we already have in our session controller. We're actually going to convert this into an asynchronous method call, so we'll add the async keyword to the start session method. This allows us to wait for a certain amount of time before continuing, so choose the appropriate time for your game. I'm going to choose 1 second, and I'll do that by saying await task.delay and then passing in 1000 milliseconds. After 1 second has passed, we can go ahead, check to see if the scene exists, the scene controller that is, and then actually call the load scene method. So we can say if scene, then we can call scene.load. The scene that we want to load is the game scene type. The second parameter is the scene load delegate, which we don't need, so we can pass null. The third parameter is whether or not this is a reload, which it is not, so we can pass false. And the fourth parameter is the page type that we want to use as a loading page transition. So that's going to be our page type.loading. Because we're using page type, we want to make sure that we are using the correct using statement for our menu. We go back to the top of the session controller and double check that we are using Unity core.menu, and it looks like we are. So everything should be good to go now. Let's go back to Unity to see if all of this works. So we do have an error that says task does not exist in the current context. That's because we forgot to add a using statement. To fix this, go to the top of the session controller and add using system.threading.tasks. This using statement gives us access to the asynchronous logic that we added to the start session method. Now we can go ahead and press play, and what we would expect to see is after about a second, we transition to the loading screen. The loading screen deactivates once we are in the game scene. So we press play, the loading page shows up, and the loading page goes away once we're on the game scene. Now the behavior that we want to add is right whenever we go to the game scene, we actually show the main menu page. To do this, we want to first start off by going to the game scene. And then here we're going to add a new page controller that has the main menu attached to it. Because we already have a canvas in our game scene, we can work off of that. So I'll start off by creating the main menu by duplicating the game over page. This will give me some of the default behavior that I want on my main menu. I'll activate this page, and then I'll make some adjustments to it. I'll start off by making the size of the main menu the entire size of the screen. I'll also change the color of the main menu to a darker color just to fit the theme of the rest of the game. After that, I'll change the color of the text. I'll also change the content of the text. We can see that the score text is rendering above the main menu, so I want to make sure that I drag the main menu over the score text. Before I forget, I want to change the name of the main menu page, and then I'll continue by making some more modifications. There's no score that's needed on the main menu. And as always, the design of your main menu is going to be different from what I'm doing here. But to continue with the minimal basics, I'm going to change the text on this button to play. And whenever we press the play button, the main menu would go away, and then we would be able to start playing the game. So I would say that these are the absolute basic essentials for the main menu, and we can go ahead and stop here. Our main menu page currently has the game over page script on this, so of course we would want to remove this and create a new page derivative called main menu page. We'll go to our game UI directory, and where our game over page is, we'll create another script called main menu page. Because our main menu page is similar to our game over page in that it derives from the page class, I can open up the game over page and copy everything into the main menu page, just so that I have a good template to start from. If I do that, I want to remember to rename the class back to its original name. Of course, in this case, we don't need any public members for the text, so I can go ahead and remove this member. And instead of the try again method, we would want the play button to actually start the game. So the function that will be public will be called start game. We can also get rid of the content and the on page enabled because we're not going to be setting any values on this page yet. But we'll go ahead and leave this function in case we want to do some initialization on this page later. I'll change the comment so that instead of saying tell the game to reset, I'll say tell the game to play. And because the try again function actually tells the game to reset, we can leave this function as it is. Now we need to go over something fairly important because our page controller is no longer a complete singleton. It's more of a hybrid. You see, we have a singleton instance that starts off in the splash screen, and that's going to be our persistent UI. But as for the UI and the game scene, that's not going to be persistent. So by accessing the instance of page controller, we're accessing the singleton. However, as a reminder, the UI that's in our game scene is not a singleton. So what we end up wanting to do for the main menu page and for the game over page is actually have a reference to a non-singleton page controller. So in both of these pages, what I'm going to do is ask for a reference to a page controller, which is not going to be the singleton. And instead of accessing the page controller.instance, we're just going to be accessing that public reference. And I'll do the same thing in the main menu. We also want to remember to do the same thing in our game controller. Our game controller does use the menu. So we want to find references where we're actually opening a page in the menu controller, or in the game controller rather. So let's do a search for page controller. And you can see that we're saying page controller.instance.turnPage on here. So because the game over page is part of our non-singleton UI, we actually want this to be similar. We also want to follow a similar pattern here as we did in the other two pages. So we'll use a public pages reference, and I'll add that public reference. I'll ask for that in our public members up here. Again, the reason that we're doing this is because now we have more of a hybrid page controller, because we're using a persistent page controller from the splash screen, which at the moment only has a loading page. As for the UI in our game scene, that UI does not need to persist over multiple scenes. So we're going to be using a non-singleton, the public reference for that page controller. Let's go back to the Unity editor to see what this looks like. Now we have three objects that are going to need a public reference to the game UI and not the singleton UI. So you can see that if I click on our game system object here, our game controller has a missing reference to the pages. So I'll drag this UI onto the pages, and I'll do the same thing for the game and for the game over page and for the main menu page. See, we have this public page reference here. So I'm going to drag that in here, and I'll do the same thing for the main menu. Now, since we just created the main menu page script, we can find that and add that to the main menu page object. We want to make sure that we set the type to menu, and then we can go ahead and drag the reference of the page controller into the main menu page. Now, to finish this hybrid integration with the different types of page controllers, we do need a way of determining which page controllers are singletons and which are not. So we actually need to add a public reference called persist, a new persist bool, to our page controller. Let's open up our page controller to see what that's going to look like. Under the public bool called debug, we'll add a new bool called persist. Now in our awake function, based on this persist value, we want to determine if this should be a singleton or not. We have some logic here that is not related to singleton logic, so I'll remove that and I'll add it at the bottom of the awake function. This means that every page controller, whether it's a singleton or not, is going to initialize this logic. At the top, we want to change this condition slightly to say if the instance doesn't exist and we want to persist. This also means that we don't necessarily want to destroy every game object that doesn't fit this condition. So I'll get rid of this else statement here as well. Now it's possible that by the time that you're watching this tutorial, these changes have already been made. So if you've downloaded the Unity core scripts and this logic is already implemented, then you can move along without having to change anything here. Now that we're back in Unity, we want to make sure that the persist bool is not selected for our game scene UI. However, we do want to go back to our splash scene and make sure that the persistent UI has the persist boolean flagged. Now that that's done, anytime that we go from the splash scene to the game scene UI is not going to be removed. And we'll be able to have one page controller that's a singleton and multiple other page controllers that are not singletons working cohesively together. Back on our main menu page, we want to make sure that this play button is actually doing something. So we click on the play button and we come down to the onClick event. We drag the main menu page into that event and then we look for the start game function and select that. Now anytime we press the play button, it'll ask the main menu page to start the game. We can go ahead and deactivate the main menu page, and on the page controller, we want the entry page to be the menu page now. So whenever this game scene loads, the menu page is going to be the first page that automatically turns on. Don't forget to go to your page controller in the game scene and drag the main menu page as a reference in the pages. So we'll want to increment the pages by 1 and then drag in the main menu page so that that page controller has that reference. Now we want to go back to our splash scene, play the game, and we would expect to see the loading page show up. And then whenever the loading page goes away, we would expect to see the main menu page activated. So we'll go to the splash scene, press play, and just see what happens. Okay, and there is our main menu. Now let's play it again and see if we missed anything. So there's our splash screen, and then we see our main menu screen, but we don't actually see the loading page. Now the reason that might be happening is because we have two conflicting page controller or UI canvases that are on the same sort order. While we're in play mode, we can go to the page controller in the game scene, and we can see that the sort order is 0. If we look at the persistent UI, we can see the sort order is also 0, and that might be the reason this is happening. I'll stop playing the game and I'll go to persistent UI, and I'll just set that to a value that's definitely higher than 0. If I press play again, we should definitely see the loading page. So there's the loading page, and then we see the main menu. Now if I press play, the main menu screen should go away, and I should be able to start playing the game. But now when I lose, we see the game over screen and we have the try again option. So what we'd want to do ideally is also have a go back to home option that'll take us back to the main menu from the game over screen. So far I can still press try again and then we can keep playing the game. So let's add a new button to the game over screen that's going to allow us to go back home, thus revealing the main menu page again. From the game scene, I'll open up the game over page and I'll duplicate the try again button, and this is going to be called the home button. I'll move the position of the home button so that it's out of the way, and I'll reset the anchors on this button as well. Now the home button is going to call a function inside of the game over page just like the reset button does, only now we need to add a new function to the game over page that tells us to open the main menu page. In the game over page, add a new function called go to home. inside Go to Home, we'll turn off this page and we'll turn on the main menu page. So to turn off this page, we simply say pages.turnPageOff. We'll pass in the type, which, as a reminder, type is a value inside the parent class page, which refers to the type of this current page. To turn on the main menu page, we can say pages.turnPageOn, and then we can say pageType.menu. Let's change the text of our home button to say Go Home or Back to Menu. We'll also switch the function on this button from GameOverPage.TryAgain to GameOverPage.GoToHome. Now let's turn off the Game Over page and play the game. From here we can press play, and then we'll lose so we can see the Game Over page. If I press try again, I can keep playing. If I choose to go back to menu, the main menu page shows up again. And then we can just continue playing. So it looks like everything at this point is working pretty nicely. So this is the final tutorial in this series, and at this point everything is functional. So once you get to the point in your game where everything works and it's all functional, you can finally get to the steps where we start talking about polishing. And so we're going to start polishing the game, making it look a lot nicer, changing some of the sprites so they look a little bit more professional, and then also adding audio to the game. So we can start adding soundtracks and sound effects. And to finish this tutorial off and to finish this tutorial series, we're going to start looking into some good sources for finding audio. And then I'll show you how you can add custom audio types to your game. So a good place to start would just be going to Google and looking for royalty-free music to use in free or commercial games. When I did that, I found a pretty cool site that I'll link to in the description that gives you a list of about 19 different websites to find royalty-free music. They give you a nice ranking of these different websites, and then they give a short description of what you might find or expect to find in each one of these websites. Now I looked through a good portion of these, and some of them are dead links at this point because it's kind of an old page, and some of them just are a little bit dated. Now the ones that I actually found really useful were number 2, this Play on Loop resource, so we'll open that one up and look through that a little bit later. And then I also found some good stuff in this Twin Musicom website. I know Incompetech is a pretty popular website, but I just couldn't find anything that I liked, but feel free to open that one up and browse around. And the other one that I thought was pretty cool that was definitely a little bit more dated was this Bandcamp website. So we'll look through that one as well. Feel free to look through all of these other sources. I didn't have a chance to get to all of these, but this is a pretty good list of very different music that will probably fit most of your games, I would think. Now, of course, you have the option to go pay for music, but I'm assuming that most of us would rather find royalty-free music. And just remember, when you're dealing with royalty-free music, you always want to credit the author, especially if you're talking about a commercial project. So you'll always want to add some sort of attribution page to your game and then give a credit to the author of the music that you're using. So Play on Loop, as I mentioned before, is a really good resource for finding music. What I did was I just went to this front page and I went to Retro Video Game. From here you can just browse through the different music titles and play different titles until you find something that you like that fits your game. They have a lot of more old school and arcade style music here, so if that's kind of what you want, then this would definitely be a good place to find that. They tell you how to credit the author whenever you go to choose a free download, and generally you're just going to be crediting playonloop.com. The second resource that I used was Twin Musicom, and what you can do here is just search for the genre. You can go to, let's say, ambient, or they actually have a video game section. You can just play through each one of these until you find something that you like. You'll notice that there's a message down here that talks about the Creative Commons attribution license. You would want to click on this and read through that to make sure that you're giving proper attribution to the author and to the website. So the third option here is Bandcamp, and what I did here was I just looked for sort of like chiptune music. So you can type chiptune in here, and then you can go to this first link, and here you have different albums of that genre of music. If you select the first one here, you'll see that you can buy the digital album and you can name your price. So remember that you're always going to want to show attribution within the game, but here they're giving you the option to basically pay nothing to get the full album. But this is a really cool site because there are tons and tons of options that are royalty free, but you still have to give attribution. And it also provides a nice way to actually pay the authors if you choose to do so. To integrate your custom audio into your game, let's go back to the splash scene, and on the core systems object, let's add the audio controller. The audio controller is another script that comes in the Unity core package. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you download that from GitHub. Now with these games, generally I'm only going to have 2 audio tracks. So I'll add 2 tracks here. And one audio track is going to be for soundtracks and the other audio track is going to be for sound effects. So inside the core systems object, I'll go and I'll add a new audio source, and this one will be called soundtracks. And then I'll add another audio source called SFX or sound effects. Then I'll drag one sound source or audio source into the first element and the other audio source into the second element. So now we have 2 audio tracks that can play simultaneously. We'll only be able to play one soundtrack at a time on the soundtracks audio source and only one sound effect at a time on the sound effects audio source. Now I'm only going to be showing you how to add one custom audio type, which is going to be a soundtrack, and then you'll be able to use the exact same method for adding new audio for different soundtracks and different sound effects throughout your game. So I'll add one object here for the soundtracks, and this will be ST01. Now I haven't actually added the audio to my assets folder yet, so I'll go ahead and create a new folder called audio. And whenever you're downloading the audio, you want to make sure you either get MP3 or .wav. You can also get a .ogg file, which is said to be a little bit smaller than both of those. So that could also save space for you in your game. I'm going to drag one of the audio types that I found, and then I'm going to go back to my soundtracks and add that as, or rather I'm going to go back to my audio controller and I'm going to add this as element 0. So I'm just going to drag that audio into the audio clip section here. At this point I have the ability to use the audio controller interface to say audio.play and then pass in the ST01 audio type to actually play that audio. And we're going to be doing that from our main menu. On our main menu page, I'm going to make sure that I'm using unitycore.audio. When the page is enabled, I want to play the first soundtrack. So inside on page enabled, I can say audio controller.instance.play audio. The first parameter is going to be the audio type. So I'll pass an audio type ST_01. That's if we look at our audio types here, you can see that we have SFX1 and ST1. ST1 is the one that I just added the audio for. So this is the audio type that I want to play. And if you want to add your own custom audio types, you would always want to make sure that you add the enumeration here in the audio type section. For instance, you would add custom audio 01. So whatever name you want to use here, you would add that and then use that as a reference in your audio controller and whenever you want to call play audio. So again, from our main menu page, whenever the page is enabled, we're making sure that we play ST01. And then the second parameter that we can use, which is optional, is whether or not we want this to fade in. I'm going to say that we do want this audio to fade in. And then a third parameter, which is also optional, indicates the delay between when you actually call this to when the audio actually starts playing. So I'm just going to give that a delay of 1 second. In Unity, you'll see that we get an error that says audio type is an ambiguous reference. That's because apparently the Unity engine namespace already has an enumeration called audio type. So let's go back to the script and make sure that we're indicating we want the audio type from our Unity core classes. So in front of audio type here, we want to make sure that we're specifying unitycore.audio. And so we're getting the enumeration from that audio namespace. Now that everything is hooked up, we can go ahead and play the game, and we should be able to hear the audio start playing. So you can see whenever our main menu page shows up, we can actually hear the audio play. So in the very same way that we added the custom soundtrack to our game, you can follow the same exact rules and same exact methods when you're adding any other audio type. So whether that be sound effects or different soundtracks. And when it comes to actually playing those, you can follow the same exact method call that we use in the main menu page. So at this point, I would encourage all of you to start the polish phase of game development on this game if you've been following along up to this point. During polish, remember, you're just focusing on making sure everything looks the way you want it to look and feels the way you want it to feel. Right now, everything should be functional. That is to say, you can still play the game right now and you can still access the menus and everything works from that point of view, but it might not feel the way that you want it to feel. So I encourage you to continue working on this project, polish it up, add all the audio that you want, and make sure you don't forget to attribute anybody that you, any art that you use or any music that you use, make sure that you're attributing those creators in your game. Don't forget to check the description if you want to learn how to become a tester for our games this year. And as always, hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed the content, hit the notification bell so you can see all of our new content coming out and be the first one to view that. If you know somebody who is getting into game development, make sure you refer them to these tutorials, and hopefully this will help them kickstart their journey into game development. As always, everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next tutorial.